Okay.
So now we will move on to Dr. Shai Srougo of Haifa University. His paper is entitled Turning the Arb Waterfront into a Jewish Space, Microhistorical Study on the Thessalonikian Maritime Milieu in the Waterfront of Haifa between 1930 and 1932. Shai, please say a few things about yourself and go on with your presentation, please.
You're muted.
Do you hear me?
Yes, now we do.
Okay, now it's okay. Apologize. I'm very glad to take part in this lecture, in this workshop. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Jewish History and Biblical Studies at the University of Haifa. I'm a social historian studying the Mediterranean peoples at the turn of the 20th century in the era of colonialism, capitalism, and the rise of nation states. Now, let's move to my presentation. I'll use the share screen. Should be the one. Share. Okay. In mandatory Palestine of the 1920s, the waterfront was an Arab space. Upon arrival, either in Jaffa Bay or in Haifa Bay, the first worker that passengers encountered were Arab barge operators, and upon landing, Arab porters. The presence of Arab laborers made both ports a non-Jewish space which threatened the Zionist enterprise both in demographic and economic terms. In May of 1921, there occurred the first round of Arab-Jewish riots. In the ports, the Arab laborers prevented the landing of Jewish immigrants and the loading Jewish export products. This went on for 2 months. The Arab control of the maritime gates worried the Jewish issue, the pre-state community in Palestine, which tried already in the 1920s and especially since the 1930s to challenge the Arab domination by the gradual establishment of Jewish port activities. Scholarship has been focusing on one major successful project in the realization of these activities, the absorption of tens of Thessalonikian longshoremen who arrived in the port of Haifa during the years 1933, 1935. However, this was only second aliyah of the Thessalonikian maritime milieu. Already in the years 1930, 1932, witnessed the arrival of 12 Thessalonikians composed of three dock workers, contractors of the Sarfati brothers, 7 longshoremen, and 2 ship chandlers. The experience of these 12 pioneers in the waterfront of Haifa has not received the proper attention despite their importance in the Zionist maritime project. This presentation fills in spaces of knowledge in the above-mentioned historiography. It presents the story of the 12 Thessalonikian immigrants using a micro-historical approach, recognizing that personal papers, manuscript, oral testimonies, and diaries can serve as an important counterweight to more formal sources. The story on the 12 Thessalonikian immigrants in the Haifa waterfront, mandatory Palestine, is re-examined through the lens of Maurice Raphael's personal letters and of an interview with Moshe Baruch, the son of Yehuda Baruch, one of the 7 longshoremen. Using a micro-historical analysis, which is based on ego documents and of oral history, this paper will provide a human perspective on the experience of the 12 immigrants in the mandatory Palestine maritime sphere, perspective that is typically not accessible in the secondary bibliography. At the beginning of the 1920s, His Majesty's government chose the port of Haifa to become the leading entrepot in the British territories of the Middle East. Construction of an artificial harbor was carried out between 1929 and 1933. And its builders included 1,800 Arab workers and only 300 Jewish ones. The Arab dominance was expressed even more in the cargo handling system. At the beginning of 1933, the dock labor force included only 12 permanent Jewish porters out of 92, and only 3 permanent Jewish stevedores among 120. The negligible share of non-Arab workers in the port labor market of mandatory Palestine was due to the fact that the preferred laborers were Arab immigrants from the Huran, south of Syria. And you can see the rotation that the major contractors wanted to make the maximum profit. They thus refrained from employing workers from Haifa who demanded a higher introduce Iranian porters in increasing numbers. The issue of Haifa can also be attributed to the traditional inclination of the diaspora Jews to find an employment on land rather than maritime occupations. But there was one outstanding exception: the Jews of Thessaloniki, who invested over ages their livelihood in the city. Their rich experience, not only as laborers, but also as entrepreneurs in a wide range of maritime activities, contributed to the eventual fulfillment of the Zionist dream of establishing a Jewish hold in the waterfront of mandatory Palestine. The well-established Jewish maritime culture in Thessaloniki is well demonstrated among the dozen Thessalonikian maritime immigrants. In World War I, the extended Sarfati family took part in job docks, both as laborers and as contractors for stevedoring services. At the beginning of 1926, the firm Sarfati Brothers was the owner of most of the barges in the port of Thessaloniki. The second entrepreneur family in sea occupation was that of Aaron and Maurice Raphael, father and son. At the beginning of 1920th century, Aaron Raphael started working as a harbor pilot, being responsible for the safe navigation and berthing of vessels in the port of Thessaloniki. During the Great War, Aaron also entered the ship chandlery businesses, supplying the moored British vessels with necessary provisions, especially with fresh stores. After World War I, Maurice Raphael joined his father's new line of business. The group exhibited inter-family connections as well. In order to deliver the ordered items to the steamers, the Raphaels had an agreement with Sarfati brothers who acted as their subcontractors, who in turn hired Jewish stevedores, among them the 7 Jewish longshoremen of Baruch. After World War I, Thessaloniki lost its traditional commercial links, both with the hinterland and the western port cities. Its acute economic decline throughout the 1920s brought the maritime industry into a near state of bankruptcy. In 1928, the firm of Sarfati for landing freight offshore was dissolved, and the workers found themselves with no work. Among them, the 7 longshoremen headed by Yehuda and Eliezer Baruch. In the beginning of 1930s, during the Great Depression, Maurice Raphael was desperate. The situation in Thessaloniki is in general getting worse from day to day. Ship chandlery business this year is not only at standstill, but what is worse, we are living on our own capital. The desperate resulting from the deep recession and the loss of confidence in the possibility of change for the better served as a push factor for the 12th to move to Palestine. Choosing the port city of Haifa as a place of establishing Jewish maritime business was the result of 5 years of negotiation involving the Thessalonikian maritime entrepreneurs, the Greek Zionist Federation, the Yeshuv senior officials, and Haifa businessmen. Maurice Raphael initiated these discussions and was its guiding spirit during the 1920s. In Haifa and in the surrounding, a considerable amount of private and public capital was invested in commerce, industry, and agricultural enterprises, and its commerce picked up appreciably. Raphael, who already visited this city in its period of growth, realized that the old wharf would soon become the port of Palestine. And he identified the economic opportunities in the local maritime services, which at the end of the 1920s were still relatively poor. There were few shipping agents and no ship chandleries yet. However, despite the length negotiations and great plans, the talks ended without a deal. At the end of the 1920s, the conquest of the sea was not yet regarded as a high Zionist priority, with only a few senior officers showing interest in turning this idea into reality. Thus, in its attempt to establish a Jewish niche in the waterfront of Haifa, the Thessalonikian group that emigrated to Haifa at the beginning of the 1930s was left without the financial or public support of the issue. And now for the story of adaptation of the 12 pioneers into the Palestine maritime environment. I first wish to speak about the experience of the 7 longshoremen in the Haifa Lighterage Company. The earlier Thessalonikian experience in the Palestine maritime environment was of the 7 longshoremen, and the story of their experience is based on my interviews with Moshe Baruch, you see him in this slide, the son of Yehuda Baruch, and the grandson of Eliezer Baruch, as well as on first personal accounts of Yehuda Baruch. At the beginning of 1929, in the waterfront of Haifa, a joint maritime firm was established, the Haifa Lighterage Company. During the 12 months of operation until May 1931, the company hired Huranis, and since July 1930, also the 7 Thessalonikian longshoremen headed by Baruch family. In all the stages of the cargo handling, the 7 demonstrated physical stamina, expertise, and the spirit of cooperation. Yehuda Baruch rowed the barge with 1 paddle only, and Eliezer Baruch, then at the age of 51, still carried on his own shoulders sacks of such weight which usually required 3 Huranis laborers at least. Being fascinated by the work of Eliezer Baruch, the Arab stevedores at first wanted to learn his loading-unloading techniques, but very soon their esteem was replaced by the fear of competition. In order to maintain their predominance in the company, the Huranis intimidated the 7 Jewish stevedores. Yehuda Baruch remembered that we had frequent brawls, we suffered insults and murderous assaults, threat to burn us alive. Despite the atmosphere of terror, 7 Thessalonikians did not quit, but continued with their work. This ended in May 1931, after 10 months, when the Haifa Lighterage Company went bankrupt. Eliezer Baruch had to start working in the salt factory as porter, and the others found work as hewers in the big project of construction of the modern harbor. As to the story of the Safati brothers, gleaning information from the communal literature and collecting personal testimonies from the 2nd generation of the Safati family and the Eroa documents of Maurice Raphael enabled me to present the experience of the Safati brothers in the Haifa water. Several months after the Haifa Lighterage Company closed down, the waterfront of Haifa saw a second attempt to establish a Jewish foothold. In October 1931, a Safati shipment of 10 lighters arrived in Haifa, but the access of this family with its gear to the port of Haifa was denied from the start by both the English Port Authority and the Arab stevedoring companies. Port Authority was set against any Jewish venture in the maritime sphere. Thus, it refused to allow the mooring of the lighters alongside the breakwater. The transport gear anchored outside the protected port space became exposed to severe weather conditions. This continued through the most of 1932, with the owners obliged to pay large sums for maintenance. The Arab maritime entrepreneurs were also opposed, and they began to resort to maritime crimes. Arab sailors attacked the barge at night. They repeatedly cut the mooring ropes of the barges, and the vessels were swept by the current to Rosh Hanikra in the north, reaching once the shores of Sidon in Lebanon. When the Tzarfati brothers complained about the expensive property which is being ruined, Edward Cate wrote, the British governor of Palestine North District advised them to return the vessels to Thessaloniki. In view of this hostile attitude, both by the British senior officers and the Arab maritime businessmen towards the Tzarfati brothers, the Jewish great merchants, fearing the loss of business opportunities and not wanting, therefore, to enter into a conflict with the local Arab contractors, decided to forego the services of the Tzarfati. Left with no income, the Tzarfati family abandoned the plan of creating an independent Jewish lighterage enterprise. They reacted. Wait a second. Some noises here. Okay. They reacted. They reached an agreement with the firm of the Arab contractors, under which they would be employed as subcontractors of the Arab company. Should be added that in the new capacity, they were usually the last to whom the Arab foremen allocated work, resulting in a meager income which was insufficient to enable their business to develop. The third story which I wish to speak about is the experience of Maurice Raphael in the shipping industry. And here we got some documents, other documents of Maurice Raphael, which I collected from his personal archive. The up-to-date descriptive raw documents of Maurice Raphael's letters provide the most detailed account of individuals' subjective experiences in the shipping industry at the Haifa waterfront during the 1930s. In the autumn of 1931, Maurice and Aaron Raphael left Thessaloniki and arrived in Haifa, where they found a livelihood in their traditional occupation as ship chandlers. I skip a bit. During the first month of operations of ship chandlers, Maurice Raphael also tried to revive his plan of establishing a Jewish lighterage business. He discussed this plan with Abba Hushi, the secretary of the Haifa Labor Council, and a prominent activist in the Yishuv who was in favor of a Jewish conquest of the sea. By the way, most of the ego documents of Maurice Raphael are in Ladino. I found very small part in English, and I added it to this presentation. I will wait for a second, forgive me.
Labor services, and now the labor will close at 6. Thank you.
This presentation.
כאן נכבד, שירותי הספרי מסתיימים כעת, הספרי סגר בשעה 6, תודה. Labor services will end now, the labor will close at 6, thank you.
Apologize, as you can understand, this presentation takes place at the library of Haifa University, and I apologize for the background noises. Okay, during the first months of operation as ship suppliers, Maurice Raphael also tried to revive his plan of establishing a Jewish literary business. He disguised his plan, as I said, with Abba Hushi, the secretary of the Haifa Labor Council and a prominent activist in the Yishuv who was in favor of a Jewish conquest of the sea. On July 1932, the talks ended with the decision to form a lighterage company to be named Hayam, the Sea. According to the agreement, Hayam would be jointly owned by Raphael, and the two parties hope that the new company will contribute to the Zionist interest in the waterfront of Palestine. Still, despite this hope, this agreement was not put into practice, and 8 months later, on February 1933, the founders agreed on its termination. As to the reasons for this, we may assume that different interpretations on the fulfillment of the Hebrew labor doctrine of Avodah Ivrit, Jewish work, led to its failure of realizing the basic agreement. It's possible that they could not agree on the relative number of Jewish workers to be employed by the planned entity. This proportional number might have substantially eaten into the profits of Rafael. It is also possible that they could not agree on the working hours, which obviously could also have had a bearing on profits. Echoes of such an ideological dispute may be found in a lengthy report of Abba Hushi from December 1931, in which he mentioned the Tzarfati plan to establish their own literature fund. However, he did not show any interest, probably because he feared that not enough Jewish workers would be employed by the Tzarfatis, as well as in view of his desire to have direct control over the Jewish workers. And I quote, "It is more important," said in your report, "that 15 to 20 Jewish workers will start the contractors, and with this we are now dealing, and there are good chances for success rather than 3 to 4 Jews," referring to the Tzarfati brothers, "will get the profits." End of quote. And conclusion shortly. This presentation makes use of testimonies given in the last few years and of raw documents written between 1924 and 1939. By extensively examining previously overlooked official papers and the new documents mentioned above, it is now possible to evaluate in such more historically accurate manner the earlier pioneer attempt to establish a Jewish niche in the Haifa waterfront. Thank you very much. I concluded.
Michael, please. Michael, we don't hear you. You are muted.
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.